1857, the first building that was erected that would be the permanent house of the government of the colony of Massachusetts was set up, and it was made out of wood. It was about half the length of this building. It served the colony very well until the day that it burned down in the year 1711, and immediately thereafter they decided we have to build a new building in its place, and so they did. And this building would be the same width as the original, 36 feet wide, but it would be about twice as long, 109 feet in length, and it would be encased in brick so that it would never burn down ever again. And that failed to happen because it burned down again in 1747, and then they rebuilt within that brick in 1748, and that is the building you're in now. So if I tore up the floorboards from the floor or the plaster from the walls, you would find post and beam construction dating to 1748. So what was this place used for? Well, a lot of things actually, and it's a complicated story. So let's start with the first floor. You walked in on that first floor, there was a gift shop, there was a rotunda with a spiral staircase, and then there was a gallery. In the 18th century, it was one great big room from one end to the other with two sets of columns down the middle. And the most important function of that place at that time was to serve as the location of the town meetings of the town of Boston. So when I say town meeting, I mean a specific form of government. Back then there was no executive, there was no mayor, and decisions were largely made by all of the eligible voters. And that was not a huge percentage of the people here at the time, but that's where they would gather. And maybe the most important vote they gathered for here was in 1740, when a local merchant by the name of Peter Faneuil offered them a new building, a building that would serve as a town meeting hall and a marketplace. And that turned out to be so controversial that the final vote was 630 opposed and 637 in favor. And so he did get permission to build the place. It's called Faneuil Hall. It's one block away. And once that building was finished in 1742, town meetings went there, and there were never town meetings held on the first floor here ever again. So what became of that first floor space? Well, that is an excellent question. There's no clear answer to that. We know that it functioned as a merchant's exchange, and a merchant's exchange was a place where all of the local businessmen, maybe an occasional businesswoman, but mostly businessmen, would gather to discuss business, share news, maybe have some deals among them. No retail ever done there. And it's true, this was a merchant's exchange on the first floor, but only Monday through Friday at lunchtime when the weather was unpleasant. So even on a day like today, they might have been outside, because that street out there was known as Exchange Lane at that time for that reason. So the odd thing about the first floor of the building, yes, it was a merchant's exchange, but Monday through Friday from about 1 to 2 in the afternoon when the weather was unpleasant. So 95% of the time, we have no idea what was going on down on the first floor. The second floor, meanwhile, up here, much more complicated story, but much clearer. There's really no mystery here. This is where the entire government of the colony of Massachusetts was housed, and we can start by talking about this room, which is the easiest to talk about because there's always been a wall right there. So there's always been a room of exactly this size. And in the colonial period, this was the governor's audience chamber and where he would meet with his council. Now, the governor of Massachusetts in the 18th century was appointed by the crown. He was the chief magistrate of the crown in the colony, which is why you came in here and you saw these portraits of King James and King Charles, because the governor wants to remind you of exactly where his power comes from. But he cannot rule autocratically. He has to work with a council, which is a group of 28 guys. And where do they come from? Well, they come from right over there. And this is where things get rather confusing, because in the colonial period, there was no spiral staircase, so disappear that from your mind, and there were no internal wall partitions there. There was a great big room here, and in that room, that is where the legislature of the colony of Massachusetts met, which was up to 125 men who were elected in town meetings across Massachusetts, who would come and meet right over there. And even when you get rid of that spiral staircase and those walls from your brain, it's kind of hard to imagine 125 men there. So picture not a modern US legislature where typically everybody gets their own great big desk. Picture instead the British House of Commons where everyone is on a bench, they're kind of squished together. Moreover, there were a couple of balconies in there, one on this side and one on that side, which would have held even more men. So that is where they meet, because they're directly elected by the people. They have a very different agenda than the royal governor, and there is frequent fighting between the two of them in the lead up to the revolution. And that fighting particularly is going to happen once a year when the House of Representatives over there elects the council that meets here. Finally, I got back to that council, the 28 guys who were nominated by that body, and then the governor had the right to veto anybody he didn't like. And the last British-born royal governor, a man named Francis Barnard, he only had 16 councillors to work with because he could not agree on a full complement of 28. So they would have fit around a table not much bigger than this one. And what is this council doing here? Well, a lot of things. Some of it very high level, some of it very low level. On the high level end of things, they are here to discuss foreign policy and military movements. And so it was here in the spring of 1755 that guy over there, William Shirley, detected a problem up in what is now the state of Maine, but back then it was part of the colony of Massachusetts. And the problem were certain Native American tribes who were allied with the French, who not only were aiding the French, but were also in the way of settlers who wanted to move in and take their land. And so it was in this chamber that he issued a bounty proclamation for those Native people, empowering colonists to head up to Maine, kill as many as they could, and bring the scalps back to this chamber for inspection. 6 months later, in the fall of 1755, one native tribe that hadn't been previously targeted, the Penobscot, were targeted by the new governor, Spencer Fitz, who also passed a similar bounty proclamation. And if you get a chance while you're here, we have a film showing right over there, it's 8 minutes in length, where members of the Penobscot tribe today, whose ancestors survived that, reflect on what that means to them. I do recommend it. Now that's some very high level stuff. On the very low level end of things, this was a place where petitions were heard. Now you've probably had a chance to sign a petition at one time or another in your life. Chances are nobody read it and it didn't go anywhere. Back in the 18th century, however, petitions were a very important part of government here, because think about it. Vast majority of people did not have the right to vote, and there were no plans to ever give them the right to vote. Therefore, how would you possibly relate with your government? And the answer is you can petition them, and back then petitions were a regular part of government and they are heard. And that is what this exhibit we have here talks about. So for example, over here in this case, we tell the story of a woman named Freelove Scott. This is her situation. It is the year 1777. The American Revolution has begun. Her husband was a loyalist who fled this colony heading back to Great Britain. She remained here with the children because she was a patriot. And with no sign of her husband, she had her attorney come to this chamber and petition for a divorce, which was a fairly common form of petition that the council would hear. And so they heard the petition, the doors were shut, and up to 29 men on that occasion sat around and debated the merits of her marriage, which sounds like a terrible thing by 21st century standards, because it is, but these were in fact the most liberal divorce laws in the English-speaking world at the time. And in the end, they decided to grant her divorce, and not only that, they set up a stipend to help care for her children until such time as she remarried. Now, a few years after that, 1783, there was a petition heard in this room unlike any that had been heard before. And so far as I know, it's the only one of the type ever heard here. And we discuss it in this case over here that is marked Black Voices. In this case, it is a woman named Belinda Sutton, and here is her dilemma. See, in 1783, the American Revolution was about to come to an end, but something perhaps even more significant had happened here in Massachusetts. Slavery had just been declared illegal, and Belinda Sutton had lived her entire life as an enslaved woman, and her master, former enslaver, a guy by the name of Isaac Royal, had fled to Great Britain because he was a loyalist. And under Massachusetts law at the time, if you were a loyalist and you fled Massachusetts, then your estate was confiscated, it was sold at auction, and the state took all the money. And Belinda's attorney came here to make the novel argument that because she worked on that estate her entire life, and nobody ever paid her, she had some of that money coming to her. It was owed to her. And they heard this petition, and the council agreed. And they set up a pension for her for the rest of her life out of the proceeds from that sale. So it is maybe the only example of a new state of the United States giving reparations to an enslaved person for the labor they had done. For all the other thousands of enslaved people here in Massachusetts, they never got anything, but Belinda did. Now, as you can tell by these stories, the council kept on meeting here even though the American Revolution had begun, and you could say that the entire colonial period in Massachusetts came to an end right from that balcony on July 18th of 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was first read there. And so independence was declared, the Lion and Unicorn were taken from the roof of this building, tossed to the ground and burned, and the council just kept on meeting here. So now there was no longer an appointed governor, instead it was an elected governor. First it was John Hancock, then later Samuel Adams, and they met in this room until 1798, at which time Governor Adams, with the rest of the Massachusetts government, processed out of here up to the new State House up on Beacon Hill, and guess what? They've been there ever since. I mean, not the original people, they all died, but their successors anyway have been there ever since. It's the beautiful building with the gold dome facing Boston Common. And when they moved there, that led to an existential question for this building. What do you do with it now that government moved out? And the answer for about 30 years was that it served as private office space. So you would come in here, you would find a lot of law offices. There was a hat maker shop down on the first floor. And that lasted until the day in 1830, when all of those tenants were informed that their leases were not going to be renewed because government was moving back in. This became Boston City Hall, and indeed it now was a city, not a town. There was a mayor. And at that time, the spiral staircase was built that everybody admires. And you would come to the top of that staircase, walk in here, and this was the mayor's office. Across the way, that other big room was the city council chamber. And as for the little rooms around the spiral staircase, well, you have to pay your bills somewhere in the city of Boston, and that is where the city clerk was, the city treasurer, and so on. So the city coming in here in 1830 fundamentally changed the interior of this building, and essentially that is what you experience today when you walk in here. It's really Boston City Hall in 1830, not the Massachusetts State House back in the 1760s. But though they came in 1830 and changed the whole place, they were not here for very long. They were gone by 1841, moved to a new building. And at that time, this place became office space again. And that was the case for another 40 years. And if you had seen this building from the outside at that time, you would not have been too impressed. It was covered by banners and signs advertising the businesses within. And many Bostonians looked at this place and thought, wow, what an old dump. They should knock that building down and widen the street. But fortunately, there was a group of forward-thinking Bostonians who dubbed themselves the Bostonian Society, who had a different vision for this place. They approached the city of Boston and talked with them about taking it over and running it as a museum. And in 1881, they received permission to do that. According to the deed for this place, they get to run it, preserve it, and they must staff every gallery with, quote, a competent person. So I hope I'm that competent person for you today, according to the terms of the deed. In return, we pay them $100 a year. So that's the deal, and it's worked ever since. We're still here. Now, there has been some trauma to the building since then, most notably between 1903 and 1904, a subway station was put in the first floor of this building, and at the time the museum did protest, but this place is owned by the city. And they thought this was the perfect place for a subway entrance because the foundation is so shallow, it's right in the middle of the street, right above the subway line. And so it was built, but when that time came, the entrances were not put on the front of the building, so it doesn't ruin the historic view from the front, and it is actually illegal for the MBTA to put up any signs on the outside of the building advertising the subway station within, so it's a bit hidden for that reason. So that is a bit about the story of this building. Thank you so much for your kind attention to you.